So welcome. We're going to start off nice and strong on something that I think, so I'm a developer, and what I love a lot at developer conferences is hearing about behind-the-scenes stories about how successful companies do certain things. So I'm starting off with a treat. You're going to hear from Vincent Cook from the Trello team to talk about how they have modernized their web stack. Vincent's been at Atlassian for 6 years. Before Trello, he worked on things like Confluence Cloud and Identity. And you'll see he's quite tall and he's Dutch. So please welcome Vincent.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the session about a little war story about what we did about modernizing Trello's web stack. So we're basically going to talk about the ugly truth. That's the whole purpose of this session. Neil already gave quite a bit away for me, but like you might have heard, I'm Dutch indeed. I'm an engineering manager at Trello. I'm based out of New York. And the only thing you should basically remember about this slide is like my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out during or afterwards. I'm happy to chat. I'm going to be around the rest of the day as well, so feel free to stop by and say hi and chat about the things or share your experience. I'm open to that. Let's dive right in. I think if you look at what Trello decided to do, and we're probably not the only ones, is like we want to upgrade our web stack. And we decided to choose for React and for TypeScript. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about the why a little bit later. Because I want to throw in a little disclaimer first. First of all, I'm an engineering manager. You could question whether you should talk about coding or not. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm also mostly a back-end engineer, so it's going to be an interesting one. So feel free to leave. The door is still open, so I didn't trick you into it. Although, if you look at React in general, it's kind of interesting, right? Because I'm used to building web services with Spring, and it's basically wiring up a bunch of components with a structured language. So it's kind of like almost the same, just on the front end. So that's why I think I can give this talk anyways. So what are we going to talk about? A few things. First of all, I want to dig in a little bit why we decided it's time to update our stack, like why it's important for Trello actually to make this move. And then we're going to share a few stories. We're going to look back how the project started and what went wrong. We're going to see where we're at right now and how we're going to move forward from there. So why do you think about modernizing? Why was it so important for the team to actually move forward with it? And to answer that question, let's go back in history when Trello originated. A key thing and a key ingredient for Trello's technology was basically we're going to build it when Trello was built. We're going to build it on the latest technology available, which was an interesting and risky choice, right? But I think the reason for that was say, hey, if you pick the latest technology, it might be risky, but it would push us forward for a long time because we're like top of the bill tech, so we can move forward for a long period of time. So what decisions were made for Trello and its code base? These were the key main ingredients. So first of all, they decided to go for CoffeeScript, which was at that point in time a pretty solid choice, provided a lot of nice language features that vanilla JavaScript didn't have, but it was only 2 years old at the time, so this is pretty fresh. The other one was Backbone. And Backbone was, I think at that point in time, around 1 year old, so it was kind of like a risky choice as well. There weren't many build systems around on the front end, so it was basically a bunch of shell scripts, which did the job, but no fancy Webpack things. However, if you look where we're at right now, after 9 years, I think it should actually be 8 years, but hey, what's a year? This technology is aging, right? Like, hey, there are so many new things that popped up recently, so we have to figure out, like, hey, how do we deal with that? Like, what is the Trello engineering team is going to do with that? And the organization is changing as well. Like, we're growing as a company, and the amount of engineers we've been adding is growing quite significantly. And that makes it harder. If you're on older technology, like having that in place, there's a lot of tradable knowledge build-up. If you want to scale out your team and you have a lot of like proprietary knowledge in place, then it becomes harder and harder to keep everyone productive and onboard people as well. So those were a set of drivers. We said like, hey, we have to change and we have to move forward. The first and the most important thing, hey, Trello is around 8, 9 years old at the moment. We want to get ready for the next 10 years. It might be a bold statement, especially like in front-end technology, but it was very important for us to actually say, hey, what's the platform we should build out to move forward from here. The second thing, which is very important to us and probably every engineering organization, is basically say we have to grow our talent as well. We want to keep them engaged and actually say, this is the technology you work with, and it's current and active, and it's like, this is really awesome for you, and this is what the things you want to work on. That's the hiring side, and also like keep people engaged at. But what we also saw when onboarding, and if you saw the little curve in a graph, we onboarded quite a few people. People struggle a little bit with doing CoffeeScript or learning how we dealt with our data. And ramping up engineers can be very expensive, especially if you do it a lot. So getting ready for that and make sure like we have industry standard technology in place is very important. The other one is dev speed, and that's always an interesting one, right? Because every new technology provides this magical thing, like it's going to increase the dev speed by X. But based on the technology that was being a little bit older, we kind of learned like, hey, we're slowing down the teams, they're not as effective anymore as possible, and there's so many other tools around as well. So that's something we wanted to give them. And the last thing is performance. There are some areas in Trello where we were hitting the limits of Backbone, for example. And solving that would have been maybe possible, but it was a lot harder. And we thought like choosing for newer technology, we could optimize better. One warning, however, because like one favorite thing, especially for engineering managers, is like when you introduce this new tool, you say, hey, it's going to solve all our problems. But what we've seen, because we have been rewriting to React quite a bit, I'm not sure what it was, but let's just continue. If you shift technology, like you're going to get a different set of problems. Like if you build out an application in React, you will hit performance limits as well. So it's really important to be aware of that. It's not going to solve all your problems for free. So that's the little caveat I want to drop in here. One other thing about Trello, the code base, it's around 200,000 lines of code. Should we be worried, or? All good? All good now? Okay, thank you. But let's just continue. So the code base is around like 200,000 lines of code, big. And we have around 26 routes, so it feels like a reasonable application. So keep these numbers in mind because they inform a few decisions we've made along the way. One other thing that's really important to know about Trello and to be aware of it is it's very real time. So that's one of the key premises of Trello. Whenever you actually update something in one browser, it updates on the other as well. And that's very important to us because it's a key feature if you want to collaborate in a setting remotely over the internet. And that makes it harder to actually rewrite it into React or a new tech stack as well. Because if you look at a lot of rewrites we've done, was basically going from a server-side rendered app and moving it into a single page app. This is basically moving a single page app into another single page app where we had to maintain state between those two, and that gives a few additional problems to solve. So hopefully that gave a little bit of context, and so hey, this was the reason why Trello kind of said, okay, let's do this. We're going to upgrade the stack, we're going to move to React, we're going to move to TypeScript. So let's see how it went. And anyone in the room knows Joel Spolsky? Few hands. He wrote this popular book for quite a long time around like Joel and software. And he's the co-founder of Trello. And he used to say, hey, if you have an app or a web application, whenever it's there for a while, you should gamma raise at it, like shake it up a little bit and see how users respond. And we thought like, hey, why don't we do the same with our technology? Like shake it up a little bit and see how we respond. And that's how Project Gamma was born. This kind of like the code name for a project to say like, hey, we're going to rewrite our stack. We call it electromagnetic Trello because that sounds cool. We have t-shirts as well, so they're pretty cool. I should have worn those. And the goal of that was basically we're going to upgrade the Trello front end. And this is where the brutally honest part kicks in. It took us kind of like 3 attempts to actually get into the right direction. So it's not going to be a success story here. We're going to fail a few times. And hopefully you don't have to do the same journey. If you have, I'm interested to learn how it went on your side. Let's go look at attempt 1. And attempt 1 was basically, let's go dark. Let's hide ourselves and just going to set a few people aside and rewrite the whole app. If you look at the app, like number of code-wise and a number of pages-wise, maybe that's a feasible option. And it had a few big advantages, right? Because one of the things we want to do, we want to have this clean architecture in place. So instead of like mixing two apps, we're going to put it aside and we're going to build it up with all the things, all the goodies we want to have around. And also like a very good focus. The team could focus on one thing, rewrite the whole thing. Once you're done, ship it. Sounds easy, right? The problem with that, obviously, you don't get a whole lot of feedback. So if you don't get it in your end user, you don't know how you're dealing with like feature parity, you don't know how you deal with like performance, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of things that you would get from getting it out there, you won't get with that. One other interesting thing is like we have quite a lot of teams like building out new features on Trello, so they had to keep up with them, which became harder and harder to do. And then priorities changed, which can happen over time, right? We put a pause on the whole. We had some shifting priorities, and we kind of decided, hey, let's build a few features out first, and then we come back to this. And the reason why I'm telling this and why it's important, because this kind of planted the rewrite seed in our heads, and that's something you see throughout this talk, that's something we came back to quite often. But after a few months, we built out some features, we shipped those, then we decided, hey, we think it's still important, it's still worth the effort. Let's do it again. We came back from one thing though, like the whole Big Bang idea, we kind of said like, hey, that's probably not like how we want to move forward. It's probably not like the right thing to do and it's too risky. So we decided like, let's go incremental, which sounds like a sane approach. And what's really important of that is basically say, hey, we don't get a big bang, we get early feedback, so that's better for the team, better for a customer, probably better for everyone. It introduced a few new problems though. First of all, we had to solve two problems. Not only like rewriting an app from one stack to another, but we also had to figure out like, how do we mix the two? And that's kind of like an interesting problem, especially if you want to maintain state between the two. And we're also very worried about the added complexity, because one of the things we were very keen of like having a clean architecture. And mixing the two, you could easily like mess it up and end up with like not a place where we wanted to be. So the first question we had to ask ourselves, like, okay, that's cool, we decided to go incrementally. We have a big decision to make, how are we going to solve that technically? And that's where a few options came in. We came with like around 6 options. And it's kind of interesting to see that some of them are pretty similar. So one end is basically we're going to replace it on component by component level. On the other end, like we're going to do a full rewrite. And we kind of already decided that's not the right way to do so. We also added another option where we said like, hey, we're going to find a small group of people, give them like Trello Lite, and see how it goes so we get that feedback while we're still completely vanilla rewriting it. I want to highlight two options we have written down here because they're almost similar but slightly different. You see the route component approach and the page level approach. And on the route level, the idea was basically to say, hey, we're going to keep the backbone router on top of it, and then we're going to replace on route by route level, on that level of the tree, we're going to replace it with React. And that was an interesting option, but we were still mixing up two technologies, and that's something we didn't want to do. The other one was basically, we're going to do exactly the same, but we're going to have 2 single-page apps. We're going to have them next to each other. And we were using this tool called Single SPA. It's an open source framework. You can find it online on GitHub. And what it does, it basically maintains the state between 2 apps. And basically say, like, hey, when you swap, we switch out the apps, and it will manage the life cycle for you, which is a pretty interesting idea. And it had a lot of the benefits of going incremental, and it got rid of a lot of the downsides. To approach like the decision we had to make is basically we had a few guiding principles as well. First of all, like we don't mess with the customer, right? Like they shouldn't notice that we had this great idea of switching up technologies. The other one is like we want to give engineers this great dev experience. Dev experience was key to us. We want to make it industry standard because I think that fits into this whole dev speed experience and onboarding people. Make sure that it is like has any proprietary stuff. We probably build up some proprietary stuff because it's going to happen because it's kind of like domain logic, but we want to minimize as much as possible. And the last one is like we want to ship fast and ship often, right? To get that feedback from our users, but also like give the team this goal to say you're in the right direction and you actually have some wins on the table. And that gave us a clear winner. Like I said before, the page level approach. This was kind of like the best of both worlds. We can still write it in isolation and move forward, but we still we still have this incremental delivery of the solution we have. And to do so and do it incrementally, we basically had to do 2 steps. First of all, we have to rewrite the header, because we kind of said we're going to have these apps side by side, and then one piece of the app that's in every view available is the header. And you can see the red little circle. It contains like your boards, search, your profile information, and some additional information like creating new boards and new teams, etc. So we felt like it's a pretty straightforward functionality, and it's a good first project to tackle. And after that, it was pretty simple. Remember those 26 routes we were having? Like we just do them one by one, and just go. And from that moment, we thought it's just a simple matter of programming. And you know, when people say that, you couldn't be possibly more wrong than that, because it didn't go that way, because it was like something else happened. So if you look at it, we went rewriting the header, and basically said, hey, we're 6 months in now, and the header is not complete, so we're not even close to original goals, so how are we going to fix this? What's going wrong? And I've been speaking to quite a few people who have been doing React rewrites, and apparently 6 months is this time frame where you say, hey, we didn't hit the original goal, something is off, and we have to figure out like why. So if you're doing a rewrite, put a 6-month mark in your calendar and say, hey, do a little retrospect and see whether we're going well or not. There were a few issues going wrong. Like, first of all, we had extremely low velocity. The team wasn't picking up, so all our estimates were way off. Initially, we said we're going to rewrite a header in 2 months. 6 months later, we weren't like complete. So why was that? Good question to ask always. The other thing is like we built a lot of accidental patterns, right? And one of the things we wanted to achieve is like build out this foundation for the coming 10 years, like I said before. But we're already starting to see cracks in the code base a few months in. And if you're going to continue this path, like we wouldn't end up in a situation where we were all too happy. So that's something that wasn't great. So the team came together. We came out to New York, and we had this little session where we did some deep introspection with the team. And it was pretty interesting to see that like we were failing pretty good, is that a thing, failing well, on a few areas, right? First of all, there were a few technical reasons why we were failing. Like I said, establishing patterns is extremely hard. A lot of people think, look at React, it's pretty simple, right? Like you have a bunch of components, you glue them together, and then you're basically done. But establishing the right components and doing it the right way to achieve the right performance and achieve the right level of abstraction is extremely hard, especially if you have a larger team. We also had a pretty shaky foundation, and it was because like we were already writing some Gamma code like very early on, and because we paused the project, this code had aged already. So some patterns were cool, some of them were not so great anymore, but we were still building on top of it. Because we felt like, hey, we already have all this code in place, but instead of like making us faster, it was actually slowing us down, which was like kind of like a harsh reality for us. And the last one is like, because we were so focused on getting this pure architecture, we had this like very complicated two single SPAs next to each other lifecycle. But initially, we thought like this is a great idea, we should just do this, but it was actually slowing us down. So we started to question ourselves again, like, hey, why are we doing this? There were a few organizational issues as well. First of all, we didn't have one goal. If you remember the goals, like we want to give developers a new stack to write technology on, we actually shifted away from that and basically said like, hey, we're rewriting Trello. And that was kind of the main goal, and that's where we were focused on, and that's where we're spending our energy as well. And that's why we were failing establishing patterns too, because we're basically focusing on rewriting and getting that done as fast as possible. And the other one, which is very interesting, is that you will basically underestimate big time. Because if you rewrite an existing app, you're just really unsure about like where you are with the functionality, right? The functionality will be so deep, so you actually don't know. You will see so many hidden features, it's really hard to replicate all of them. A good example of that is like in Trello, when you copy like 10 lines in a card, it will ask you, hey, do you want to create 10 cards, or do you want to create one card with this description? Which is like a really neat little functionality, but there are so many of those in the code base, it will be very hard to replicate. So if you're going to rewrite, you will underestimate the time it will take to actually do so. So keep that in mind and constantly check like why you're behind schedule, because you will be. Another interesting one is like, and here's Joel again, he kind of warned us for that. He wrote this article like in 2000, which is 19 years ago from now. And he said the one thing you should never do, and he's using Netscape as an example, is rewriting. Because when you're rewriting, you're so busy with rewriting, all your competitors will go across you because you're rewriting your stuff, but you're actually not building any features your users like. So don't do it. And another fun fact about it actually is like, in the README of the repository of this project, we had a link to this article. He said, like, Joel warned us, never do this, we're going to do it anyways. So I think Joel was right at the end anyways. So this is kind of like a little bit of history. This like felt pretty bad. We had 2 failed attempts, so what's attempt 3? And that's where we're at right now. And I actually would have loved to do this presentation like 2 months later, but I think conference schedules not always line up with doing conference talks like. So let's see where we're at right now. We decided to go back to one goal and be very specific about it. So instead of like, hey, we have to do rewrites again, the only goal we have is enable teams. So we said by the end of the financial year, we want to enable 2 teams or more, preferably, and use this new stack to actually build out features and get them out there in front of our customers. So we had to go back to the drawing table again. So remember this page? Hopefully you'll do. This option was out. We tried it, failed. We also did the go dark and rewrite, it failed, so it wasn't an option either. So we actually went back to the approach we did find very scary in the beginning of the project, so we didn't do it at that point in time. But now we were convinced this is basically, given our goals, the only option we have. Which brought us to attempt 3, leaves and nodes. And what it basically means, at every level of the app, we want to pull out a backbone view and put in like a React component end to end. So if you look at it, for example, at the back of a Trello card, we want to replace this little checkbox in a checklist. Or we want to remove all these buttons on the side and actually say, hey, this is React now. And people, if they build a feature in that direction, they can actually do it as such. But we also wanted to make sure that we did it like end to end or full stack front end, if that's the thing. Basically, we were already adding React components to our front end, but we didn't do state management. Those components had direct knowledge about backbone models, and that's something we didn't want anymore. We also had another decision to make, because when we started this project, we were heavily based on Redux. And Redux was still the cool kid at that point in time. But internally, we have a lot of GraphQL movement. And also, like I think in the community, GraphQL is moving into the direction of becoming the new favorite. Personal opinion, I'm not sure. We can discuss that a little bit later. So we had to make this discussion, build out this foundation on GraphQL or continue with Redux. And we kind of decided to go GraphQL because, again, we wanted to build this for the next 10 years. If we wouldn't do it right now, we missed the opportunity. But it was also interesting as well, because this was a significant choice for the team to actually do so, and we already had 2 failed attempts. But we decided to do it anyways. And is anyone using GraphQL in the room? Oh, quite a few. That's cool. It's just this really nice way of doing things, right? Because we were already doing very similar things to optimize data loading, optimistic caching, updates, listening to updates over WebSockets that powers like the real-timeness of Trello. And a lot of the stuff did fit very well in GraphQL. And so we could do it in a standardized way instead of like building out our own proprietary solution, which was one of the goals as well, using industry standards over like stuff we invent ourselves. So we decided to move forward with that. We're using Apollo to do so. And I will come back to that a little bit later. To actually enable people to build on top of it, we want to build this environment that we had batteries included, right? So feature teams should just jump in, build features, and focus on that as much as possible. So we have to provide the right abstractions here. And to do so, we had to introduce like 2 big APIs, basically. First of all, the render API. And the render API is basically responsible for allowing people to put in like a React component anywhere in the codebase in Trello and make sure it actually does its thing. The other thing is like we have to deal with state management. How do we manage state between 2 apps, one based on GraphQL, one based on backbone models, and how to keep them in sync and make sure developers don't have to worry about it too much. They will have to worry about it a little bit because like no abstraction is perfect. Those were the key deliverables we did set for ourselves. Which brought us to one of the key components we did build out. And like this, it seems pretty small, just like one component, it's easy to write. It's called the Gamma component wrapper. And it's kind of like the piece people use to actually mixing components. And it does basically all the wiring, right? It makes sure like it's connected to the router, it's connected to history. It makes sure like data management and state management is available. You can access local storage, which is the same on the other side. So everything you need and to build an app is already wired up for you. So you don't have to worry about it as a feature developer. So how does it look like? This is a simple React component. It's just a button. It has one prop, actually two, because it has a click handler as well. But we leave that out for now. You can pass that name, and it will render a button with the name. Pretty straightforward. If you look at like a CoffeeScript file, and this is a backbone view, which most of the code is written as such, you can basically say, hey, we want to add a div, and I basically say, render this Gamma component. This is like a little helper function. You pass your React component, give it the props you wanted to have it initially, and it's all wired up. So that's basically it for a feature developer. You don't have to worry about all the other things anymore. And that's one thing we wanted to achieve, because like, if everyone has to worry about all these like mix-up things, then we get probably like a big mess and wrong abstractions everywhere. With this, we basically say like, hey, this is where you start your React root. From that moment onwards, you don't have to worry about things anymore. The other one was basically make sure everyone can use GraphQL in the code base from the get-go onwards. So as part of the Gamma component wrapper, it actually gives you an Apollo provider as well. It's all wired up, so you can just fire away a GraphQL query and load the data for you, which is pretty neat, because I think it fits really well with the whole set of like React, TypeScript, and GraphQL, which makes it all very typed and very specific, like how you can read and update data. Although we had one issue though, Trello doesn't support any GraphQL on the backend, so we had a problem. We didn't want to wait for our backend team to actually say, build out this whole API, because that was pretty risky, and doing that well is probably going to take us a little bit more time. But we did want to do GraphQL. We did a little spike on it, which is actually pretty neat, because we spiked it out in an afternoon, and based on that, we were pretty confident like how to make it work. So we only do it on the front end. So if you look how Trello works, it's basically like the key thing on the front end is the model cache. That's where all views load the data from. That's where REST is being called, the REST API is being called to actually get information from our server. But it's also it's connected to the WebSocket. So when an update happens on the Trello backend, it basically updates the model cache and all views are getting updated. So that was kind of like an interesting center point to actually attach our Apollo cache to. So instead of like having an Apollo client that goes out to the server, we basically say, listen to the model cache, subscribe to the backbone events, and we had it working, which is pretty neat. So this is still something we want to remove at some point in time, but not just right now, because like, remember, our goal was like enabling other teams. And speaking about enablement is very key for your organization as well. Like if the team that's focused on providing those tools, like you have to figure out like how do you can enable and empower the teams who are going to be using it. And for some mysterious reason, we call it the pit of success. I'm still not sure why we use this term, but it's still there, so I decided to pick it. This is the best picture I could find about like describing the pit of success, because normally it's like you fall off the stage and it's not very successful. So just we want to make it easy for teams to be successful writing features in this new stack. So the support is like, as an organization, we kind of said like, hey, we still want to do some rewrite things, so we split up the team. One part of the team was responsible for rewriting the header and finishing that one up. And the other team, the only measure of success was basically say, hey, you're going to rewrite, you're going to provide the tools and make teams successful and actually get them to build features with the stuff you've built. So it's not only like, hey, you build stuff, but you're also responsible for making to use and actually have them build features with it and getting into the customer hands. So what was the main mission? First of all, provide batteries. We said we want to build this batteries included environment, so they are going to build the batteries. Another important aspect for it is basically providing the right amount of onboarding and engagement with the teams. Because like teams won't go to a page and read up on this new thing and say, hey, this is easy, you can still use it. That's where we want to be at some point, but we're not there yet. And the other one is, I think it could be an NYPD slogan. It's basically enable and enforce. So basically provide technology that's enablement, but also enforce that people are doing the right thing as automated as possible. So how did I do that? First of all, key responsibilities like establishing patterns. So first say, you have to pass at one-way doors. And a one-way door is basically a decision that's really hard to revert. But every time you build something up, make sure you have like a very deliberate choice, like is this a one-way door or not? If not, go as fast as you can. If it is, okay, maybe we should pause and make a very conscious decision about it. For example, GraphQL was a pretty important decision for us to make. Also, I think every engineer in this room is probably aware of this, like we love abstractions, and we tend to make abstractions very quickly, and that's what we did early on as well. And they end up normally being the wrong abstractions, right? And that's something we didn't want to do anymore. So we're happy to replicate code for a while. If we say, hey, now it's going to happen. This is the 4th time we're building this, or even the 5th. Now it's probably the right time to actually abstract and move forward with it. And the last one is like, and that's, I think, in good architecture is always important, like optimize for change. So, and that's also fits back into the abstractions. Like, is it easy to replace a certain technology? Because then, if you don't like it anymore, it doesn't fit your purpose anymore, then you just swap it out. Sometimes that's really hard to do. For example, for us, throwing out GraphQL or TypeScript, it's going to be very hard to do. That's something we bought into. We also come up with like having an engagement model. So whenever a team wants to join and build out stuff, we were very strict on like how that would work. So we first want to sit down with the team, like, hey, do we have the bandwidth to actually take on another team? If so, okay, let's chat. Explaining like what are the limitations of the stack we currently build out. If they're cool with that, hey, you want to build this feature, it's going to be really hard because we don't have the support yet, then maybe you shouldn't do it. Work on a technical design together, just what components do we need? How do we need to load data, etc. So basically make sure like everything is in place to say, okay, this is a great idea, or this is going to be very, very tough. What we do then is we embed one engineer of the front-end platform team and say, you're going to help them build out this feature to make sure we establish the right patterns. And after a few weeks, like we try to limit the time a team, someone is embedded because it's an expensive way of doing so. We consider the team proficient, and based on that, we actually say, okay, you're ready to go now, and we're going to repeat the process. This is very like a non-scalable way of doing so, but it really helps to get the team started and reach a goal to move forward with a few teams in the right setting. The other thing we do a lot is like we want to build this community of share learning. So all the tech leads come together for every week, and basically share their problems, patterns they discuss, things they ran into, and we have a discussion what's the best way to solve them. So this is a very high-touch, high-bandwidth meeting if people are like deep in the problem space. We also want to create a space where all front-end engineers can hang out, right? We call it the front-end forum, and that's more like a one-way broadcast meeting because like there's probably 30, 40 people in that, so having a discussion is not very useful. So what we basically do there is say, hey, this is the patterns we came out with last week. This is how we do things now. Or this API is deprecated and you shouldn't use it because it's not the right thing to do. So right now, we have two teams onboarding and about to ship the first features, which is pretty exciting. And we're also measuring like the impact of the team, right? Because it's very easy to say, like, ask people like, hey, how is it going? It's going well, is the common answer. Or you get this really harsh feedback. We try to be as objective as possible. So we send out a survey every quarter to the team to get some numbers and say, like, how is it going, and to see whether the new tooling actually makes an impact. It could make it worse as well. That's still a risk for us. So let's look ahead a little bit. Like I said, it would have been great if he could have done this like in 2 months. So what's going to be the main focus for the future? First of all, we want to scale out this process. Like currently it's so high touch, it's not going to scale well. We want to make sure the teams are independent and they don't need an embedded engineer to get the stuff done. So hopefully we're going to be there in a few months. And that where is like the API comes into place. Like hopefully you have the right API in place that's battle tested and actually make sure people can build out the things they actually need without needing to come back for help. And the last thing is like we want to scale out like the tooling and the enforcement we have in place because there's a lot of like nice tooling around, like for example linting, which is a very cool thing, or Strictia, where you can control the structures and how people build certain things. So make it as like common and almost like having a stamp of good practices available. And there's still one interesting thing we have to think of, and that's the cleanup that will be there at some point in time. Because we're going to build all those leaves in our code base with React code, and it will have a lot of almost like Backbone and CoffeeScript branches. At some point we probably reach a critical mass where we say, hey, now the time of doing it in this model is over, and we have to rewrite the old stuff as well. And you probably need a little bit more of critical mass there, so we will see when we reach that tipping point. So that's going to be an interesting one too. All right. What should you take home? So that's the summary. This is the last thing, only thing you have to take away from this session. First of all, set one goal, right? Because it's really easy to mix up goal as part of the progress. So set one goal, stick to it, and reevaluate whether you're still going in the right direction. Is it still worth spending all your good engineers on this problem space, or can you better spend them somewhere else? Also, if you're going to do rewrites, you will underestimate, or you will overestimate your ability to do so, because rewrites are just hard because you have fixed scope, and you can't do much about it. Also realize that new technology is going to be pretty tough. You will learn, and over time you look at your code like, hey, this is pretty rubbish. This is something I wouldn't build it again as such. So keep it in mind. You will learn and you will establish patterns over time. So also figure out whether you should start small or large. I think one of the problems we did, I think we started too big. So we established patterns quickly and a little bit too quickly. And the last one, reaching an architecture, a pure architectural state. If you're in a rewrite situation, it's not greenfield anymore, so you have to make concessions on that area, right? Because otherwise, you're not going to make any progress because you have too much baggage already there. So keep in mind that set a goal where you want to be and iterate on that based on a solid plan. That's it. Thanks for listening. I will be around all day, so if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Vincent. We do have a couple minutes. Does anyone have any questions, or are you guys working on some relevant problems?
I'll get it started. In the approach that, as you learn those things, obviously building for change, you've identified as it's important, right? Especially these days, more people are turning over. So did you try and do something to the original platform, twitch it a little bit so the change would be less painful as you moved? So re-architect the current app with Coffee a little bit so that the actual change would be better or easier to do instead of just...
Yeah, I think if you look at we're optimizing for this massive change, right? This big bang approach, and to optimize for change in this situation, people are going to replace component by component, which makes it still easy to make the wrong decision, where to replace the component and how to replace it. And having that in one component and centralized, if you feel it's not optimized enough, we can change it in one place instead of having it across the code base everywhere. So that's one example of that.
Okay, good.
Does Trello uses the React component in Atlaskit written in the Atlaskit?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
The components within the Trello, are they the Atlaskit components?
Not at the moment, because if you look at Trello has a different look and feel than Atlaskit, and Atlaskit has very limited theming support, so we can't control it. So we're chatting at the moment with the Atlaskit team, how to solve the problem, because we definitely want to, because we have a large team building out those components, and we want to reuse as much as possible from that.
Any other questions? Does everyone here know what Atlaskit is? Hands? All right, cool. That's the React UI library that Atlassian puts out. Any last second questions for Vincent? All right, thank you very much, Vincent.
All right, thank you.